record it on this computer and we'll make do with it like that, and I will upload it to YouTube later. All right, so I want to get down to business because I do have a meeting at 7 and I want to make sure we have time for all the material as well as any questions that might come up. So even though Purim doesn't begin until the month of Adar, which in this year, Purim will fall beginning on the evening of March the 16th, I still want to get it underway for a couple of reasons. One, it is the next holiday, and it's always good to be thinking about the next holiday after the last one finished. Even though Tu B'Shvat, which just passed, is not a technical holiday in the usual sense of the word. There's no liturgical changes, no halacha that is obligatory, no mitzvot. It is still a nice milestone to mark and good to notice as it goes by. Purim then becomes the next holiday. So I want to make sure that we can start it as early as possible, especially because Purim is often misunderstood. Not the story so much, although we are going to cover that, but the specific focus and the way we celebrate Purim is often misunderstood. It is often thought of as being a kid's holiday. It is often thought of as being a frivolous holiday, just about fun and games. And while there is a lot of fun and even some games, and those are good for both kids and adults, there is a lot more going on in Purim, and it is a very spiritual holiday as well, and a historically relevant one. I have one additional reason for bringing Purim forward in my timeline of the curriculum, and that is to act as a counterpoint to the unfortunate events of last Shabbat. The attack and thankful rescue of all the hostages in Texas reminds us that there are still people that have a twisted view of the Jewish people and that still try to do us harm. And that is very much at the core of the holiday of Purim and the story of Esther, and exemplified in the character of Haman. So it is very fitting to point out that this is not, what happened in Texas is not the first event. Unfortunately, I fear it won't be the last, but we will always be able to rise above and overcome. So let's get down to the meat of the story. So to understand the story of Purim, we have to do a little bit of history, like so much of Judaism. So a reminder that the Jewish kingdom of Judea, the southern kingdom, fell to Babylon in 586 BCE. And at the time, many of the Jews of the land, in fact, the vast majority of them, were taken away as captives. Now, Babylon would eventually fall to the Persian Empire, and many of the Jews who lived in that time would return to Israel and rebuild the Second Temple and so on. But many other Jews continued to live in what was now the official diaspora, the official dispersed community of the Jewish people. And many of them continued to move eastward from Babylon into the Persian areas and became part of the Persian Empire. Indeed, all the Jews, really, of the world were part of the Persian Empire, because that empire stretched all the way from India, the border of India, to Ethiopia. And the Jews were pretty much found, by and large, almost completely within its span. Now, that empire had a policy very different than the Babylonians, well, mostly different than the Babylonians, which was a policy of toleration. They allowed different minorities to conduct their own affairs, to have their own culture, provided they were compliant with the Persian demands. And it is in that setting that the story of Purim takes place. Now, most of the events of the story, not counting the small global view, are set within the city of Shushan, also known as Susa in the modern terms. And this was indeed the Persian capital of that time. Now, we are going to loop back later on to talk about the historicity, the clues to the historical time of the story of Purim. But for the moment, I want to get the basic story outlined. So is everyone good? Then we will press on. So the main events of the story follows a very clear pattern. It starts off with a very lavish party, in the midst of which the current queen, known as Vashti, angers her husband Achashverosh, who is the king of Persia, and she is removed. Following this, there is a an attempt to find a replacement, and the different women of the empire are brought. This is not a voluntary beauty contest. This is abduction and essentially slavery, as these women were not really given choice in what they were doing. They were taken to be assaulted by the emperor. Now, one woman, a Jewish woman by the name of Hadassah, who went by the name of Esther in the local language, is brought to Ahasuerus, and she finds the most favor. Indeed, that becomes a recurring pattern of the character of Esther. She is someone that finds favor in the eyes of everyone. Later on, she flips that and becomes the person who causes fear in the eyes of others. But to start, she is very much a person that other people seem to like. That is, she is very agreeable. I will point out this is an example that we see in this time period of a Jewish person having a name that is within the Jewish community, Hadassah, and outside the Jewish community, Esther, where she is, in a sense, having this dual relationship to the worlds around her. We saw something similar with the man Daniel, but this is the most extended discussion of a person having this situation. Now, this woman, Esther, has an uncle cousin, depending upon how you wish to read the text, named Mordechai. And Mordechai appears to already be involved with the Persian government. He is already some level of bureaucrat. Now, this is not that surprising. The Jews, like one of the many ethnic minorities throughout the Persian Empire, would be involved in the Persian governance. And the fact that Mordechai is working for the government would have been considered good for the Jews, of having a person there advocating and working on their behalf, and perfectly ordinary for the rest of the empire. This man, Mordechai, hears a plot against the king. He informs against the plotters and thus saves the king's life. This is recorded, although at the time he is not explicitly rewarded. Now, at the same time as all this is happening, Ahasuerus, the king, appoints a new number 2 person in the kingdom, and that person's name is Haman, or Haman in English. Now, Haman believes that everybody should bow to him the same way that everybody bows to the king. However, Mordechai refuses to bow. Now, there are many different explanations for why Mordechai might refuse to bow. I just try to point this out because it's often misunderstood. It is perfectly fine for a Jew to bow to an acceptable, legitimate monarch of a country, provided that monarch does not claim to be divine, and provided that monarch does not take any idolatrous worship into the ceremony of people bowing to them. So if you are a Jew in England, you would bow to the queen. If you were a Jew in the time of Persia, you would bow to Ahasuerus. Bowing to Haman would also generally be considered legitimate, except for a few things. The Midrash claims that Haman deliberately would have idols on his clothes, images of other gods, as a way of having people worship him / the idols. And as such, Mordechai refused. Others contend that Mordechai was simply refusing to bow with Haman because he did not see him as a worthwhile or proper number 2 to the kingdom, and wanted to challenge his authority. For whatever reason Mordechai refuses, Haman becomes irate, incensed at this man who refuses to recognize his authority. He sees it as a threat, undermining his authority in the eyes of others. And as such, he buys the king's favor to kill all of the Jews. Now, by all the Jews, I mean all of the Jews of Persia. Rather than only targeting Mordechai, he decides he wants to exterminate all the Jews, a Holocaust plan, if you will. Again, there are a couple of reasons why he might have taken this tactic. One may be, as our tradition says, he was the descendant of the Amalekites, who had tried to destroy our people numerous times in the past. Another is the idea that if he had only killed Mordechai, he would have been afraid of reprisals, that other Jews, part of the ethnic minority, would have attacked him in retaliation. And third, there is also the likelihood that by using Mordechai as an excuse, he was going to enrich himself by stealing the booty, the loot, that would come from the slaughter, and also enrich his allies, building his own independent power base, which could indeed rival and threaten the kings, something that happened with some regularity within the Persian Empire. So there are a number of reasons why he might have escalated this beyond a one-on-one conflict. Obviously, the Jews are worried, and they turn to Esther, who is the queen after all, well, one of the many women that is in the court, but who is given primary position, and they convince her to help. And she bravely, because she has to out herself as a potential victim from this plan, goes to the king and sets up a plan in motion where she will isolate the king and Haman in order to try and convince the king of the problem. Now, she doesn't let this out of the bag in the first meeting, and Haman, who is very happy about being invited to the party, nonetheless is still miserable because Mordecai won't bow, and he goes to the king to try and get permission. However, coincidentally, and I'm putting that in heavy quotes as we will discuss, at that same time, Ahasuerus is unable to sleep, and he is made aware again of the story of Mordecai, who saved his life by outing the assassins, and he decides he wishes to honor him. But Ahasuerus, true to his form throughout the story, is unable to make decisions of his own. Instead, he has to constantly turn to his advisors, and in the middle of the night or early morning, waiting in the lobby, the only advisor that is there is Haman. Haman comes in and gives advice on how to honor this mystery person, thinking that the honor is being set up for himself. It turns out it's being set up for Mordecai, and Haman has just talked himself into becoming the one to show honor to Mordecai, which is really humiliating for him. This is the turning point of the story where Haman's fortune begins to go down. After Mordecai is celebrated, the second party of Esther takes place, in which she reveals her Jewish identity. She asks the king to save her, and Haman gets himself into further trouble by rather clumsily trying to beg for mercy from Esther. And in the process, the king gets even angrier and indeed decrees that Haman should be killed and that the Jews should be allowed to defend themselves. Very important point there. The Jews are only allowed to defend themselves. They do not set out to attack the various people allied with Haman. Instead, they are simply given permission to fight back, and it will not be held against them as an illegal insurrection. This, of course, does eventually happen, and the Jews are able to defeat their attackers, taking none of the loot in the process, meaning not stooping to the level of robbery that was part of the original Haman scheme. And they celebrate a holiday and decide to commemorate that holiday in perpetuity, meaning until this very day, in honor of that victory. All right, that is the basic plan of the story of Esther. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, hold on a second, Rabbi, where's God? We see God very explicitly in the story of the Exodus and throughout the rest of the Bible. God is there with Joshua, God is there with the judges, God is there with the kings, although the kings are very rarely with God. Even throughout the time of Babylon and our return, we still have an overt presence of God throughout the narrative. In the book of the book of Esther, which tells the story of Purim, famously, God's name is not mentioned explicitly even once. So does this mean it is a secular tale? Is this merely, and that word is meant to be reduced in importance, is it merely a story of Jews living under foreign rule and trying to do the best they can? Well, yes, it is that, but there is a spiritual element to it as well. In fact, it is the element that all of us, since the time of the Bible, since the time when overt miracles and Hollywood-style events are no longer being performed, that we have to see God in our own way. So we can see this very clearly within the lines of the book itself. Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther when he's trying to persuade her to help. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Mordecai is giving voice to the wisdom that will guide our people for the next 2,000 years, which is in the absence of prophecy and in the absence of overt miracles, it is up to us to be the explicit miracle, and it is up to us to interpret the events of our situation in a way that will be harmonious with God and harmonious with what God has tried to already instruct us. So we become the instrument of salvation, indeed fulfilling God's wish, but we have to recognize that it is our decision, our implementation of God's desire at that moment that will create this ultimate act of redemption. We know redemption will come. We may not be able to know where it will come from, but that just means each of us has to look upon ourselves as being personally responsible for doing what we can to advance that. And that then becomes a signature lesson for how Jews will live for the next 2,000 years until this very day. We are not going to get fiery letters in the sky. We are instead going to get the fiery letters in our heart that were given to us by the Torah and studied and understood and reflected upon and shared and discussed and debated in order to know how to act. And indeed, that has worked pretty well for 2,500 years. Now, I mentioned that we would talk about, did this really happen? Is this an actual historical event? And without going into too much detail about what does history mean when we talk about something 2,500 years old, and whether or not we should expect that the king of Persia was actually speaking in Hebrew, or whether or not this is a Hebrew translation of his Persian text into Hebrew, or whether or not this was a paraphrase of the king's words into Hebrew. We don't need to go into too much detail on that. There is room for much debate and discussion, but we can look for some connections. So when we look in the Greek list of the Persian kings, we are often left with little clue as to who Ahasuerus might be. Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, these do not exactly sound like Ahasuerus. However, when we look at the actual Persian names, which are considerably different than the Greek names, we get a lot closer. So Persian names are different from Greek. It is not surprising, the same way that English words are different than Greek, or different than French, or different than Japanese. The Greeks, when they heard Persian, would convert it into something more agreeable to the Greek language. So if we look at the Persian names, especially of Xerxes, we will, and I apologize to any people who speak Persian, see that he was known as Kheshayarsha. Now, Kheshayarsha doesn't exactly sound like a Ahasuerus, but it is much closer. Many of the key letters are indeed the same and in the right order. And when we look at the Aramaic reading of that name, Aramaic not only being a Jewish language, but being a generic language of the ancient Middle East, we can see that Harshisha or Harshiarsha or Ahashiarsha becomes much closer to the Hebrew version Achashverosh or Achasharash. So it is quite likely that it is indeed a closer approximation of the name of Xerxes in the Hebrew than the name Xerxes is in the Greek. So most likely, we have, I think, good reason to believe that the king that ruled during the time of the story of Purim was what we would call Xerxes in English and Greek. I'm going to continue to call him Ahasuerus or Xerxes, only because I know my Persian is atrocious, but hopefully that helps a little bit. But then we also have to say, but is there any additional reference for this? Well, when we look at the Persian inscriptions, we can see that Kheshayarsha or Xerxes or Ahasuerus ruled between Hidush and Kushia. Now, this would be the Persian varieties of Hodu and Kush, which are the Hebrew names of India and Ethiopia that are stated right at the beginning of the Megillah. So indeed, this is a very telling match of the bookends of his empire. We also can see by looking at the timeline that Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. And if we were to put that onto a timeline of the story and a timeline of Persian/Greek history, we could see that with the story being held in the third year of his reign, which is 489 BCE, and knowing that Esther was chosen in the winter of the seventh year of his reign, which would be 479 BCE, then we can now match it up with the idea that Xerxes returned from his failed invasion of Greece, which was held in the fall of 479 BCE. That is to say, we know that he returned to the palace of Darius, which was known as Susa, which is Shushan. And this palace, of course, was renowned for its splendor and wealth. So this would fit very well. Xerxes would have been returning after his failed invasion. And indeed, at that point, his thoughts might be looking to comfort, not only of the splendor and wealth of Shushan, but maybe also a little more female comfort, as unfortunately many of the emperors of the ancient world would do. So having Esther be brought at that time and having the whole rigmarole of enslaving these women happen at this time would indeed fit the mood of the Xerxes if that was the time that he returned. Now, we still have to ask ourselves, but what about Esther? We don't actually get a name of an Esther within the text. We also don't get a record of a woman named Vashti within the text. However, among the Greek records, we don't have Persian parallels. We do know that Xerxes had a wife named Amestris. Now, in order to understand whether Amestris might actually be Esther, we have to do a couple of things. One, we have to remember that the Greeks, from whose sources we have the knowledge of this woman named Amestris, that they hated the Persians. And they describe Amestris as being a cruel queen who slaughtered her enemies. They say she was born from a military commander known as Otanes, but do not mention her being Jewish. Now, that is not especially surprising. The Jews were not very well known in the Greek world at that time, and it may not have been of particular interest to their chroniclers. But we do know that Esther did have a father named Avihail, and that name happens to literally mean my father, a warrior. And just as Esther had a different name, Hadassah, so he, meaning this man, Avihail, might have also had a different name, perhaps Otanes, in the Greek version, or at least something similar enough to turn that into a Greek version. And the fact is that Esther did kill her enemies. That might have been considered cruel by the Greeks. They certainly were not a fan of a woman having any authority or power, and being perhaps unaware or uncaring of the story of why Esther had attacked her enemies. They may have simply put it down as Greek propaganda against the Persians of, look, this guy named Xerxes lets his wife make decisions. That would have been considered extremely humiliating to a Greek audience. But there is one more layer that we can peel away to see whether or not there is indeed a connection here, and that is to look at the name of Amestris. So I will remind you that in Hebrew and in many of the ancient languages, the consonants were the more important form. That is why those are capitalized in our text. Now, the is ending is a Greek form, just like the s ending at the end of Xerxes. So they would often add an is as an ending to the end of many names. So we can safely remove the is, believing that it being a Greek addition rather than native Persian. Now, the core letters of Esther are the Samach Resh, and we can ignore the th sound because in the English word Esther, they are trying to represent a particular sound, but that is not a sound that would have necessarily been vocalized at the time. So the regular T sound is probably all we need. Now, Amester and the stir is identical, apart from the mem at the front. And that mem may or may not have been an affectation, an addition either from the Greek or from any other transmission in the chain of passing along the story. So it is very possible that this Amestris and Esther are in fact the same person. We don't have a smoking gun. We don't have a diary written by this person. We don't have enough information from archaeology yet to make this a conclusive decision, but there is enough evidence to say that there is no reason to doubt the situation as we see it. Indeed, it would not be at all surprising for there to have been courtly intrigue, scheming and plotting, assassination attempts, rivalry between the different ethnicities of the Persian Empire. that was all par for the course, normal behavior for the Persians, as near as we can tell from the records we do have. So there is really nothing exceptionally out of the ordinary from the story of Purim that makes it feel non-historical. Yes, it may be a specially framed, phrased, and detailed account given from our point of view so that we as Jews can take away the right lessons from it, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It means that it happened and was important enough that it was recorded in a way that it could become an important resource for our people for the next 2,500 years. And just as a little aside, if Amestris was indeed Esther, then that would mean that Artaxerxes, the emperor that came next, who was the one that supported the rebuilding of the temple, would have actually been the son of Esther and would have actually been Jewish, according to Jewish law, even though we know that he did not act as a Jew, as an emperor. So it is potentially possible that his support and backing of the rebuilding of the temple may have been a gift to his mother and her people as a fulfillment of his duties as a son as well as an emperor. Okay, so now we get to talk about the mitzvot. We've done the story, we've talked about its history, but as I mentioned, the story is important because of what it inspires us to do, and how we put that into action is, of course, found through our mitzvot, through the specific commandments of the holiday of Purim. And there are 4 mitzvot that are specific to the holiday of Purim. There are also some customs and liturgical changes, which we will cover, but these are the 4 mitzvot, the 4 commandments. One is Mikra Megillah, the reading of the Megillah. The second is Mishloach Manot, the sending of gifts, meaning presents to other people. The third is Matanot Le'evyonim, which are giving gifts to those that are poor. And the fourth is Seudat Purim, having a special Purim feast meal. Let's take a look at each one of these. So the reading of the Megillah, well, as Rambam says, who's always my go-to source because of his clarity of language, everyone is obligated in the reading of the Megillah. Men, women, converts, and slaves, every category of society. Children should also be trained to read it. Even Kohanim should neglect the temple service to come hear the reading of the Megillah. That is how important the reading of the Megillah is for our tradition. This is not a if you have time kind of commandment. This is everything is put on hold to make sure you have time for the reading of the Megillah. Now, it is read both in the evening as well as in the morning. And it is considered to be okay that if you hear it read, as opposed to reading it yourself. Even though literacy has always been a very important part of Jewish culture, not everyone has always been literate. And of course, they would need to hear it in order to fulfill this commandment. And not everyone, even if they were literate, would have a copy of the Megillah, as written texts were very expensive. And as such, they would have to rely on someone else reading from their text in order to fulfill the mitzvah as well. It is best to read it from a proper scroll, from a klaf, like we do at Temple Israel. And like we also do during the community minyan on the morning of Purim. Now, it doesn't have to be from a scroll if there is no alternative. If you are trapped somewhere in Alaska and the only thing you have is a book, then by all means fulfill the mitzvah with your book. But it is certainly best to come together with the community and to read it together with that community from a proper scroll. Now, that proper scroll is, of course, written in Hebrew. And one who speaks a language other than Hebrew and hears the Megillah read in Hebrew, written in the Holy Script, meaning done correctly, still fulfills his obligation, even though he does not understand what is being read. This is one of the few times where you can fulfill a mitzvah, even if you are not able to understand each of the words being said. If it was written in Greek, he also fulfills his obligation, even if he does not understand. Greek was considered to have been also, the Greek translation was considered to have also been officially sanctioned by divine decree. Therefore, the Septuagint was considered to be acceptable. There aren't that many people today who would still use the Greek over the Hebrew, I have to point out. And if it is written in Aramaic or any other language, one fulfills the obligation only if the language is understood. So if you are unable to find a Hebrew copy or unable to hear a Hebrew recitation, read it in the language that you understand and make sure that you are actually understanding the text. Oh, hold on a second. I forgot I was also going to mention, there is a custom during the reading of the Megillah to shout at the mention of Haman's name. Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier, it is considered that Haman was descended from the Amalekites, and the Amalekites were such a horrible people to our nation when we were leaving Egypt, trying to wipe us out, and especially attacking the weak and the vulnerable, that we were commanded to blot out their name, meaning to remove them from the annals of history in order that their culture of violence not persist. We keep that tradition alive when it comes to the name of Haman, and every time we hear his name, you will get people stamping or booing or hissing or shaking a grogger, a noisemaker, as a way of trying to wipe out his name. However, it is important to know that we do that after we hear his name, not during the name, because we actually do need to hear it in order to hear every word of the Megillah. So there is a little bit of a tension here, a little bit of a paradox, perhaps, that we have to hear it to wipe it out, but we have to hear it also to fulfill, and that means that the name gets perpetuated. But this is a reminder that the idea of someone like Haman, someone like the Amalekites, somebody that preys on the weak, somebody that is filled with only hate and violence and greed and a desire to power and dominate, that is something that we should always be willing to shout against and to fight against. As I mentioned, we also have a mitzvah to give gifts, mishloach manot. Again, a person is obligated to send 2 portions of meat, 2 other cooked dishes, or 2 other foods to a friend based on the verse, sending portions one to another from Esther 9:22. Now, if one does not have the means, meaning if you don't actually have enough money to be able to send this to someone else, then you should instead exchange meals with someone else. That way, both of you will fulfill the mitzvah while also both having enough to eat. This was a very important way for people that are poor to be able to still celebrate and fulfill the mitzvah. And we'll talk more about how we can budget for a holiday in just a minute. But this gifting of portions was the primary form of giving gifts to each other. Nowadays, many people will also put in different toys or fun things. This is really meant to be the primary gift-giving holiday. Not Hanukkah, I'm afraid, but Purim. Food was considered to be the best gift and one that could be enjoyed immediately at that time, especially during one's feast later on, which is why that was the primary form. And still, when we give a gift, even if we are giving other trinkets and toys, it is important to still give different portions of food as well, so that the person will be gladdened in the most intrinsic way on the holiday. We are also commanded to give gifts to the poor, what is known as matanot le'evyonim, and this also comes from Esther 9:22. And as Rambam says, one is obligated to distribute tzedakah to the poor on the day of Purim. At the very least, to give each of 2 poor people a present, whether it be money, cooked dishes, or other food, based on gifts to the poor, the explicit instructions in the Megillah. We should not be discriminating, meaning we don't means test this. We don't try to give it to the most deserving poor, the nicest poor, the one that we like, the cutest kid that comes begging. Instead, we should give to whomever stretches out their hand. This is a general principle for many of the mitzvot of tzedakah, that it is not for us to sit in judgment on those who are in need, but instead to do the best we can to help meet that need. We also have the perhaps most famous part of Purim, which is the Seudah, or a feast. What is the obligation for this feast? Like, how do you know if you are feasting enough? Well, again, Rambam says, a person should eat meat and prepare as attractive a seudah, a feast, as his means permit. He should drink wine until he becomes drunk and falls asleep. We're going to come back to the drinking in just a minute. But this feast, I must repeat for everybody, because everybody gets this wrong, unfortunately, is a feast that happens on the day of Purim, not the evening. So, for example, this year, when Purim begins the evening of the 16th in March, this feast would be happening on the afternoon of the 17th of March. By afternoon, I mean before nighttime, as Judaism reckons the fall of night. Now, unfortunately, I will see many people who think it is their obligation to become drunk and dangerous as they will be driving home on the evening of Purim. There is no obligation to drink in the evening. And certainly if you are going to be driving, you are commanded not to be drinking, because if you are driving while drunk, then you are now a danger to everyone else, including yourself. And that is not a mitzvah. You are not fulfilling any command. You are not being pious or holy by doing so. And in fact, you are bringing shame upon our holiday and upon our people if you act in that manner. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy a little bit of a libation, of a refreshment during the evening, but it must be done in a moderate way, and it must be done in a way that is still respectful to the event of Purim and still safe for yourself and everyone else. Now, how do we actually work out the budget? Because we've got a lot of obligations. We've got gifts to each other, we've got gifts to the poor, and we have a feast to prepare. Well, again, Rambam, I think, explains it very well. It is better to be more liberal with the donations to the poor than to be lavish with the seudah or sending portions to friends. Meaning that if you are trying to divide up your budget and you are setting aside a little money for the feast, a little money for gifts, and a little money for gifts to the poor, you should spend more on the poor than you do on either of the other two portions, on either of the other two mitzvot. As Rambam says, there is no greater and more splendid happiness than to gladden the hearts of the poor, the orphan, the widows, and the converts, meaning the strangers, those who don't have a network to support them. One who brings them happiness resembles the Shekhinah. You are godlike when doing this, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive those with broken hearts, as Isaiah 57 talks about. When a person eats and drinks in celebration, but locks the gates to his courtyard and does not provide for the poor and bitter souls, his happiness is not the happiness of mitzvah. You are not doing a commandment when you do this, but it is the happiness of his gut. You are just being a glutton. Such happiness is a disgrace based on, from the prophet Malachi, I will spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. What kind of feast is just dung? The feast where you are ignoring others in need while just stuffing your own face. This doesn't mean that you give everything to the poor. Of course, you need to celebrate and have gladness. And it doesn't mean that if you are also poor, that you have to give away too much, but you should always give enough to those that are in need. And it is a sliding scale. And trust me, there is always enough in each house to find gladness if it is properly focused on helping others, as well as feeding yourself in this moment of celebration. There's no reason a person cannot fulfill all of these commandments and make sure that they and the community are happy in the process. Any questions on that part of the feasting before we get back to the drinking question? Okay, so where does this idea come from that we really need to get drunk? Well, it's based on the Talmud. Said Rava, a man is obligated to drink on Purim until he no longer knows the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai. So that, as I mentioned, if someone said cursed Haman, everyone would go boo. And if someone said blessed Mordechai, everyone would go yay. He seems to be saying that you should be so drunk that if someone says cursed Haman, you would say yay. And if someone said blessed Mordechai, you'd say boo, because you were too drunk to be able to tell the difference. Okay, now with that teaching of Rava in mind, we get a story from the Talmud. Rabbah, different person, and Rabbi Zera celebrated the Purim meal together. They got drunk. Rabbah arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. It was apparently a really wild party. The next day, he prayed and revived him. The following year, Rabbah said, would the master like to come and we will celebrate the Purim meal together? Basically, he extended the invitation again. Rabbi Zera said to him, a miracle does not occur every hour. So Rabbi Zera says, no, I'm not coming back to your house. Last year you killed me. Now, whether he actually physically killed him or merely injured him and then prayed and thankfully he was recovered, we don't need to get into that debate. The point is, a terrible violent tragedy happened because of the drinking. And Rabbi Zera has enough sense to realize that maybe being around Rabbah when he is that drunk is not a good idea. And so he is declining the invitation for the next year. So this small fragment has gotten so much attention, and many people who could care less about Shabbat, could care less about studying Torah, could care less about giving tzedakah, could care less about keeping kosher, will say that this is where they are religious, that they are going to drink themselves into a stupor because, God told me I'm supposed to do it on Purim. Well, maybe. That is to say, there are many different opinions in Jewish tradition of exactly what it means to become that drunk. So I just want to give you a few varieties to help you understand that there is not a monolithic approach to this particular mitzvah. So the Bach, one of the medieval commentators, says that one is literally required to become so intoxicated that one can't tell the difference between the two phrases. And he says that because otherwise, why would Rabbah have gotten so drunk that he accidentally injured, killed somebody that was there with him? Now, the Beit Yosef and Tosafot, two other medieval commentary strains, said that, in fact, what it literally means is you can't recite the full song. Cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Zeresh, blessed is Esther, cursed are all the wicked, blessed are the Jews. Now, that song can get a little tongue-twisty, especially if you're singing it in the original. And, of course, we shouldn't believe that Rabbah's statement is taken literally, that there was actually murder or that any person should drink so much that they would be capable of murder. It is meant merely as hyperbole. Now, the Aguda, a little bit later, takes this a little bit more strong, and he says, actually, you only have to get so drunk that you can't do the gematria of Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, which means to translate both of those two phrases into their numerical values, to do the math, and realize that both of them actually equal the same number, 502. Now, I should point out, I cannot do that gematria very well on my own without a pencil and paper, so I guess I'm already drunk enough. The Kolbo says that the drunkenness shouldn't happen at all because it obviously could cause sin. And we know that that is possible because of the warning story that comes immediately after, that is meant as proof you shouldn't drink that much, rather than proof that that's how much you should drink. And a little drinking, yes, is allowed if it will make a person more joyful and comforted, especially for the poor. Sfat Ament just means that you rejoice and that you drink continually, not that you actually get drunker and drunker and drunker, but that you continue to drink a little bit more than would be usual. The Ramah says something similar, which is that a person should drink and drink enough that they then want to take a nap, because while you're asleep, you are not being able to tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And the Mishnah Brura, a more modern commentary at the end of the 1900s, says very much like the Ramah, but he puts on the extra warning that amount of drinking only works if you don't interfere with any other mitzvot. So for most of us, that is a very important cautionary tale. And as such, we should really be very careful about our drinking on Purim. If you absolutely want to take the Bach's opinion that drinking means super drunk, then please, please, please do it in the privacy and comfort of your own home, where you know you can be safe and where you know you won't cause any harm to yourself or anyone else. But for the rest of us, I think there are plenty of ways to celebrate and enjoy the holiday without getting dangerously drunk. Now, in addition to the mitzvot of Purim, the reading of the Megillah, the giving of a portion, the helping of the poor, and the having of a feast, there are liturgical changes. There are things that we change in our tefillot, in our prayers, to notice that this happened. The most important is, of course, the Al Hanisim. Excuse me, this is a paragraph that is added to the Modim, to the next to last blessing of the Amidah, where we celebrate and recount the essence of the story of Purim in the one paragraph abstract version, the synopsis. Now, surprisingly, we do not recite Hallel on Purim. Now, Hallel is the collection of psalms that we recite for other miraculous moments of delivery, Pesach being the most famous, but also on Shavuot and Sukkot. And the question arises, well, why do we not celebrate, or why do we not read Hallel for the celebration of Purim? And there are a couple of explanations. One, as the Talmud itself points out, the reading of the Megillah is like reading Hallel. Hallel is a poetic, extended song of celebration, and in its way, so is the reading of the Megillah, just a little bit longer. Two, Hallel is not read because the victory was not a full victory. Right? The victory did not bring redemption, like the Exodus, for example. Instead, it merely prevented catastrophe. And while that is definitely worth celebrating, Hallel is reserved only for moments of full deliverance. And this merely kept us from succumbing to worse. We still were a vassal state of the Persians. We still had diminished autonomy. This was not a complete redemption. And the victory happened outside of the land of Israel. And Hallel is centered upon those moments of redemption that focus on us in Israel, or in the case of the Exodus, of getting to Israel. So for these reasons, we do not recite Hallel for this holiday. But we do eat, like most holidays, and there are some especially favorite types of treats. The most famous are known as Hamantashen, or in the Hebrew, Oznei Haman, which literally mean Haman ears, because they are thought to look like Haman's ears. And these are pastry cookies that have fruit or some other type of filling. Now, I hate to tell you, but these were nothing that were eaten in the time of Esther. These are very, very similar to a type of pastry that was popular in the 1700s, that were pockets of dough that were filled with poppy seeds called Montaschen. That is to say, the German for poppy pockets, which is a great German word that sounds really, really similar to Hamantaschen. Montaschen, Hamantaschen. It doesn't take a great wordsmith to make a joke out of these and turn them into a holiday food and a holiday favorite. Obviously, there were many other types of treats that might have been enjoyed before that, but the Hamantaschen have really become the main treat. This three-cornered, triangular, fruit-filling type cookie is incredibly popular to this day, as is the wearing of costumes. You will see people dressed up in costumes during the Megillah reading or during a carnival, and there are a number of reasons for this custom. The most important is because the miracle of Purim happened through hidden identities. Nobody knew who Esther was. Nobody knew who Mordechai was to Esther. Nobody knew that Haman was evil. And it was all wrapped up in the clothing and the different ways that people were being dressed, their rise and their fall, the dressing of Mordechai for success, the return to his sackcloth afterwards in mourning and prayer. All of the clothing and identities were wrapped up together. And as such, the wearing of costumes is a very fitting celebration. It is also very fitting because, like I mentioned before, the presence of God seems to be a bit more hidden in this holiday. The presence of God is not as explicit, not as overt. As such, wearing costumes is a way of reminding ourselves that sometimes we have to look past the surface if we want to see things more fully. Like I just said, we also will have a carnival. Most communities will have a carnival that is often focused on children, but it doesn't have to be only. There's usually something fun for families as well. Now, I will point out that for the last couple of years, we have been having very heavily modified carnivals because of COVID. We are still trying to work out exactly what we'll do this year, but we will try to make sure that it is safe for everybody because just like with the drinking, we want to make sure that as we celebrate, we are not putting anybody in danger. And that is the ultimate quick version of how Purim works. Hopefully you'll have noticed from our discussion this evening that Purim is not just a cutesy story for the little kids, that Purim is a very serious story of political and personal intrigue and personal courage, as well as national fear and liberation. That Purim is a timeless representation of life in the very dangerous world of living outside of Jewish autonomy, especially in autocratic or dictatorial communities. And as such, it has a lot to teach us about the spirit of the diaspora, about our finding of God even in hidden ways, and about, well, how to still have fun even when there have been tragedies. And that is something that has kept us going for a very long time. Are there any questions or comments before we finish for tonight? All right, then I will thank you all very much. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube a little late, the connection wasn't working, so I apologize for that. But hopefully it'll be on live stream next time. But for now, I hope you are at least watching the recording. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.